Alrighty, here we go. We are at tape 3, and this is a fun one for me because it is weapons, and I love weapons, as you can tell from my channel. So before we go any further, one correction I have to make, and you might notice that the titles have changed on the original two videos, and that is because I was saying it was 1959, and I had seen that source somewhere else saying that these videos were from 1959. I have been corrected. It was late 61, early 62, according to another source. So again, I will just make that very clear. The dates are different to what I initially said. There you go. All right, let's get into it. We're going to start looking at the weapons techniques. And there are some really, really cool things in here. A lot of things are very much the same as we have expected and as we have seen in the previous videos. However, there are some observations I have a little later on, as you'll see, so do stick with me, and hopefully you'll get to that point where you'll be able to jump in and go, oh yeah, or give me some other ideas as we go. So let's jump into it as usual. So the first technique we have is brushing the storm. So from here, brushing the storm is very much similar to what it was. We have that step in to the outside of the weapon and then the palm strike on the inside of the weapon. And then we have the follow through. Now this is done today with like a follow-up elbow into the takedown, or a groin strike into the grab, or the leg takedown here. And again, it's just one of those things where we essentially kind of do a little bit more today than we would have done in the past. So we would do, a further step forward on the left leg with the elbow. We would grab to the groin, then do the leg drag. And we would also have an additional kick in there. So we have a scoop kick into a side kick or blade kick to the knee, whereas this one, as we can see here, ends a little bit differently. So as usual, we'll just jump back and forth and scrub back and forth on these a bit, just so we can look at the different things. But in here, for example, we have that primary leg pull, opposite to the dance of death, if you will. And then we have a kick to the groin in this case, as opposed to what we would usually have nowadays would be that left leg scoop into a right blade to the kind of supporting leg, not the leg that you're holding, but the other leg as well. So brushing the storm was there. As usual, we've just evolved it over time, or it has grown over time in its complexity. There are some additional concepts, additional moves in there as well that we don't see here. The next one then is obstructing the storm. So we have obstructing the storm, which isn't surprising from a weapons technique standpoint, because when we look at, or obstructing the storm in this case rather, it is obviously another overhead strike. We're very fond of our overhead strikes in Kenpo. But again, the overhead club strike coming in, we use that X block formation and we bring it down into an arm bar. The astute among you will realize in my previous videos, crossing talon was one of those things that also carried over, and crossing talon, yet again, as you saw in that video, it was an inside grab to the arm. So crossing talon and obstructing the storm, apart from the weapon versus empty hand attacks or nature of attacks in these, they are the same technique. They are essentially done from two different starting points. One from a low grab, low line position, and the other from an attack from above, which would be a straight line position, but they both end up in that very straight armbar with the wrist grab and everything else that we would normally do. So again, obstructing the storm is not a surprise that it is actually going to be one of the weapons techniques, given that crossing talon was also one of those basic techniques that we saw in previous videos as well. Now from here as well, we'll see that he's checking on the wrist and he comes to the elbow, as we saw here. There's an outward elbow here. And you can see where he's bringing it to cross and talon in this case as well. So ultimately, that technique is at this point, or in 60s here, essentially it is the same technique as crossing talon. Crossing talon in their version, apart from, as we said, that wrist grab, was a step in. You have that arm bar, you had an outward elbow, and then you had your dropping elbow as well, or your overhead downward elbow at that point as well. So again, the technique is the same. The principle is the same. The concept is the same. It's just that the weapon varies and how we deal with that weapon. So we have that cross block and we take it from the high line, as I've already said. So interestingly, those two techniques are exactly the same. They're not unalike in today's day either, obviously. But we would do things a little bit differently. Some people do have that step in, as we said, and we would deliver a knee directly as opposed to doing any elbows on that one. And again, then the other side is I've seen that done over the years where we have a step back once you take the weapon to give you a little bit more distance, and it would be basically a thrust kick or kick into the face at that stage as well, or body, depending on the target. So there's variations there, but typically speaking, today's day or in today's world, we would use a leg strike as opposed to using our elbows directly after. Could that be down to repetition of the same moves? Quite possibly. So variety, it could be giving us more variety and so on by teaching us that you can also use your legs from that position, not necessarily just delivering the elbows because we've already done that. So it's expanding our options, expanding capabilities, as Parker's system has been known to do over time as well. You often hear that it's not overkill, it's overskill. Within reason, yeah. It's giving you more options is the main thing that I would see on that side of things as well. For three, then, is Defying the Storm. So here again, we have that same step in. You will have seen me demo in some of my videos that double block for 5 swords, but that step in is very much there below the elbow with the left hand, on the bicep or into the shoulder, depending on depth of action, with the actual right hand in this case. But you are double blocking and stopping that arc of that strike as well. Again, knowing that we're interfering and meeting the action in this case, as opposed to letting it pass us, as some of our techniques would do today. So again, we have that step in. As usual, you have the arm drag. Here, it's done more of a cloth drag, which is interesting. Whereas I have seen this done, obviously, and in some versions, you will see it done where the elbow is actually the pivot point here, and it becomes a shoulder arm lock. So when you pull, you elevate the wrist, and you pull the elbow back in this way, kind of creating a snapping motion, and bringing the person into this position as well. Here, interestingly, back in the 60s, it was more of a cloth grab at that point. And, again, probably is in some cases still a cloth grab today, but I've seen it done where it is the arm that you're actually moving, that you're jarring the elbow, as I said, and applying that shoulder arm lock in this position. But this is a cool little note that I've literally just picked up as we're going through this as well. And then here you have a knee followed by a kick. So the knee being the first impact, and then the kick to, I would presume, groin, possibly other leg or support leg if obviously it's available to you. But again, you'll notice that you're using the knee into kick here as well. Something similar to what we would see in falling cross when we hit the knee across the arms across the knee, and then we kick to the groin and we land with our elbow. In this technique, we today typically do a kick and we follow it with an inward downward elbow like so, or inward downward overhead elbow, or whatever complexity we want to add to the name. You get the idea. It's a big circling elbow that drops inward on top of the person. But ultimately, when we drop it in, that's how we would do it today. But as we notice here, Parker is actually doing an upward elbow. So again, he's landed in a position where the hand is already chambered low and the kick has gone low. The person is probably sitting low, and now he hits that upward elbow, as opposed to what we typically see today, which is that inward downward elbow at this point as well. So again, just a little nice variation that we see. And I quite like the upward elbow. Me being me, I like to be in close. I like to be moving with people. And that upward elbow or brushing the hair motion is always something very simple and very easy. And a lot of people still teach that today in modern combatives or, reality-based self-defense situations and so on. These are things that come out naturally at a close range. So I do quite like that as opposed to the big circling one, which makes sense when you have that range. And again, if you're grabbing the shoulder as we saw here, or the jacket when we saw here, you are by nature going to be that little bit closer to the body, hence why you would do your knee and then your kick. In the version that I've talked about, when we step back and we do that pull on the elbow, you now have the distance between the elbow and the shoulder to, it's extra distance, extra range. So your kick can be a little bit longer. You might not hit the knee immediately, and you do have distance and time for that kind of circular elbow, as we said, coming down rather than coming up. So in this one, we're a little bit closer on the weapon, which makes sense. You want to smother the person's action. You want to make sure that they can't do what they need to do, or have a follow up at that point. So an interesting take on the technique, where we might have gone from a slightly closer range version of this technique to a slightly more extended range version of this technique as well. Let me know what you think. Do you like this version or do you like the new version? Personally speaking, I kind of like this version. Not gonna lie. Here we have Returning Storm. And again, I have Returning Storm, or Returning the Storm. Um, I have it listed here in inverted commas. And the reason for that is, as we know in today's Kenpo, Returning Storm is actually a inward swing or horizontal swing going across your body into an outward swing going this way. So again, if we equate that to our inward hand sword going to our, or sorry, horizontal inward hand sword going to our outward hand sword like so, essentially what we're looking at here is we have it now that there is a swing across, which is essentially why you get to that zone of sanctuary. You step outside the circle to the corner of the square, and then you come back up with your follow-up move on the backswing in this case as well. At this point, it didn't happen. We didn't have it there. So it's interesting to note that instead of always swinging off the open side, as we call it, this one actually swung from the closed side of the body first. So we didn't get to the closed side and then swing from there. We were already on the closed side, or the attacker was already on the closed side, which is an interesting idea as well. So it just goes again, it shows that most people, of course, will probably swing from the wide one. It is the most instinctive way to swing a stick, as I've said in a number of my videos. But ultimately, at this point, it was we do it from a backhand. What happens if the person swings from the backhand? Instead, it would have probably evolved to Parker went, what if they miss you? And then you swing back. That's where Returning Storm comes in as a technique nowadays in today's one. So again, here you have the same takedown. You have the kick, but you'll notice that it's two kicks. In our version today, it typically becomes you step back, you have that drag down on the arm, you have that check on the elbow, you have a kick either to the face, body, groin, whatever's available, and it's typically that stiff kind of rising back knuckle strike that we hit either across the body or in some circles we come behind the body again. Interestingly, anyway, as I said, here it's not. It is the two kicks again that we have. So you have a kick to the body, and then you have a what looks like a blade. And again, quality of the video might be an issue here. But again, it looks like we have that going on here as well. Technique 5 is what I'm calling affectionately Broken Storm. And this is one of the ones that tells me there were ideas and kind of maybe even gives me a little bit of insight if we watch it, gives us a little bit of insight into the mind and how it worked, and maybe where certain elements, as I've said in the past, like things like intellectual departure or spreading branch, certain elements of those techniques, while the techniques wholesale weren't carried forward, they certainly were used in other parts as well. And this is one of those examples. Now, I call this Broken Storm purely, again, the techniques didn't have names at that point, but as you can see here, we are essentially doing that initial breaking move. If I equate that to a technique that we already have with a name like that, it would be Broken Rod. And as we know, Broken Rod would be a gun technique or a revolver technique, as we'll see a little bit later on. So again, that initial grabbing and breaking movement into the next move comes from Broken Rod, just obviously not done from the rear like we would do in today's modern system. So again, this is why I've called it Broken Storm. It's not that the technique had a name. I just like to put a picture to something similar to our nomenclature today. It is visual, it helps us to visualize what the techniques are. So here we have Broken Storm. And again, you have that hammer strike to the groin following the break, which is very much like Broken Rod. Obviously, then Broken Rod would progress forward, check the arm, and take the weapon out, do other stuff, pistol whip him to death, whatever the case may be. But here, the weapon is actually still stripped out and used in this kind of upward, downward manner, which would be similar to how we would use the pistol in this case as well. So again, we would have the break here, hammer strike to the groin. We then have a wrap of the arm and a pass through with the stick being used to strike the inside leg. This would be very akin to the extension of Obstructing the Storm, which uses the stick in a very similar manner as we step through and we strike the leg, front and back, and so on. So again, interesting to see that that technique in its entirety wholesale does not exist in today's system. We don't do that wrap and trap with our storm techniques in the same way. However, it is interesting to note, as I said, there are definitely elements of what became Broken Rod. And I say what became Broken Rod because it doesn't technically exist in this tape, as you'll see a little bit further along. But again, what became Broken Rod at that point, there are elements here of that. There are also elements with the stick of extensions we do on Blue Belt, for example, for Obstructing the Storm. And also we use similar hand movements in things like, thrusting lance today, where we bring the weapon up potentially, or we strike up, we strike down, we strike across, we hit. These types of things also exist today. So again, interesting note on that as well. And here we have a chain technique. So I didn't give this a name because chains don't necessarily have names in our system. We don't have a kind of a thing, basically. Maybe it's a pendulum. Probably not, because a pendulum is a downward strike. But anyway, regardless, it is a chain technique. What would you call a chain in our system today? What name would you give it to match with the Kenpo terminology that we already have? What would a chain, or what should a chain maybe have as its name? Pop that down below if you want as well. I'd be interested to see what people think and how they think in terms of naming these things. But this is a chain technique, as we said. So we will carry forward on this. It is a step out wheel kick, or roundhouse kick. And then we have a follow-on kick to the back, or kidney in this case, as we can see here. So not unlike to maybe one of like leap from danger, or one of those types of techniques that we have today, but definitely not something we do. That idea of committing to, that technique in the same way, stepping out and just throwing your kick in and then hitting that when a weapon is swinging at you, it's interesting to look at it, because that weapon is obviously coming across your line and you're stepping out towards that arc. There's a lot of very deft footwork and deft maneuvering to be kind of taken into account there. So it is a kind of inward downward swing with the chain as well. So obviously you can move outside of that, but it is still coming across your body line. So might break a few rules for us. Certainly the idea of crossing your body line and striking at the same time is addressed here, because that roundhouse kick into the stomach or into the midsection is obviously a strike as we're crossing our outward line as well here. But like I said, interesting that we don't have that technique, or any parts of it in some ways, as a weapon technique today. So interesting that that was completely removed. Chains, while they follow similar arcs to, or flexible weapons, let's even say flexible weapons, while they do follow similar arcs to a stick or any other weapon that will have a slash done with it, they do have some different mechanics involved, as they can continue to move even at the point where the hand is stopped. They can continue to flail around, or wrap around, or trap, or do other things. So it's interesting that we don't necessarily address flexible weapons in that way in Kenpo either. We've stuck to the kind of three main ones, being the club or stick, the knife, and then the gun in this case as well. So again, interested to see why that would have been removed, or why we wouldn't have necessarily addressed using things like a flail weapon at that point, or a flexible weapon. So if anyone has any insights into that, please feel free to share as usual. Raining Lance. This is very definitely Raining Lance as we have it today in terms of the entry, not necessarily in terms of the full technique. But we do see there's that take from overhead. We have that trap into the leg. We have that initial elbow that we would have in Raining Lance. And then it progresses a little bit differently. So here we have our trap into the hand, or into the leg, as we can see, that stab. We have that initial elbow again. And then we have a step off and a back knuckle across the body. So that would be very similar in some ways to potentially the same movement that we do in Flashing Wings. So that idea of hitting down across the back of the head, you've already traveled through, again, that principle of crossing your center line, or the crane principle as we know it, that idea of hitting across your center line when you cross it, or hitting as you cross your center line. And then you have that strike into the throat again. Very similar, again, like I said, to Flashing Wings. So while not exactly Raining Lance as of today's kind of movement or pattern, we would obviously have things like, you have that low check with the strike into the throat. You then have that rip into the throat here going on the forehand. You have that ridge hand kind of strike wrapping around the neck, that crane arm, stepping through, and then you have your hammer taking them down, and palm strike in the face. So a much longer, much more complex technique with different principles in it. Whereas in this case, it's very much base moves in there. The elbow has already gone through or gone in, so your hand is already chambered to hit that hammer strike. You come back through, and then you have that, or back knuckle strike rather, could be a hammer, could be a back knuckle, and then you have that, hand sword into the throat as well. So interestingly, a shorter technique, and similar to what we've said in the past, these techniques were very direct and to the point, and then they obviously expanded as more more terminology was added, more of the principles, more of the concepts that Parker brought in were added later down the line as well. Glancing lance here. So again, glancing lance today, as we would do it at the start of Form 6, kind of has this lovely hooking motion, a pull, a break, or a check or a slap on the elbow. You have your pin, your poke to the eye, we hook off. There's a whole heap of different things here. It is very different here. However, taking it from what was brought to Ireland, as I said initially, the knife technique did have that kind of pass and hit as we saw here at the first part of this move. So again, it's very similar to what would have been brought here initially, as far as I've been told, obviously not being alive at that time, as old as I look. But again, it would be a very different approach here. So we'll try pause on that as we go through. So the initial step, as we can see, is that kind of hooking motion, but more of a slap than a kind of grab and trap that we would try and do today, this kind of shape here as we would do it. Again, what we're looking at here is it's very much clear that weapon out of the way and then proceed with your attack. So again, we have that, we have our kick, and then we have that eye strike going in. Now, obviously, in today's ones, as I've said, that eye strike is a little bit different. We would have it as potentially a direct finger poke into the eyes, and then you have your hook and so on, as per how it's done in Form 6, and how a lot of people are doing it based on the way the syllabus is written as well. So again, just interesting to see that here. You have that hook off, as we can see, to clear the arm. Now, it also looks here, and it could be just the way the video is shot or anything else, like it's more of a slash with that, as opposed to it's more of a stab, which we do today. So again, it could just well be one of those things where it was done as a slash, which meant you were stepping back again, as we said, to that zone of sanctuary, getting out of the line of the arc, and then passing it or continuing to pass it out on that line as well. So again, just might be something I'm picking up on the video, but I saw it here. We can also see there, and there is a zoom in, there is a very clear grip here that is in play on that arm. So once it passes, I've heard of Parker's hands being described as meat hooks, and that definitely looks like it right there, in fairness. So again, in one of those cases, we can see here his fingers are very much gripping around the elbow or gripping on that part of the arm. So it is interesting to note that there is security there, a form of security where he is not just kind of letting the arm flow and then, the person is able to come back with a backswing or anything else like that. He has actually secured here as well, which is interesting to note. So again, we have that kick to the knee, we have that blade kick, and then you have that kind of eye poke coming in on a slightly more curved approach as opposed to our more direct approach today. So again, a nice technique, an interesting version of the technique, and good to see where it came from. So glancing lance right there. And then we have clipping the lance. So again, this is a lance technique using modern terminology, lances being knives, obviously. Today we have clipping the storm in our syllabus. Clipping the storm being against a low poke with a club or low stab with a club, and the moves are very similar. In the technique syllabus, we say we have 154 techniques overall. If you're following, 10, 24, 24, 24, all the way up to your brown belt techniques, we have 154 techniques. Doesn't really matter how you split them out. There should be 154 in the current syllabus today, written the way they are, if things haven't been removed or anything else like that. But it's also said there are 156, and 2 of which are not in the technical syllabus, the technique syllabus. They are actually in the form. And Form 6 is that form. Here, clipping the lance is one of those techniques. So again, you have that clipping the lance technique in the form today in Form 6, but here you have it as an actual technique back in 1961/62. So again, interesting to see that technique would have been there at the very start, and we swapped it out for a storm technique down the line, which is not addressed in this as a storm technique. Much of a muchness, let's be very clear. I mean, a stab with a stick, a stab with a knife, the line is going to be the same. The danger, of course, is going to be very different with those two things. But again, it's interesting to see that this was the initial technique, and then we kind of took the stick version of it or the storm version of it for the actual technical syllabus and kept only this version of it in the actual form against weapons, which is Form 6. Very much similar to how the technique is done today. You've got that initial strike with the follow-up strike on the lower arm as well, and then you have that chopping strike or outward hand sword to either the philtrum, throat, as it's done today as well. We can see the Parker patch there, which is nice, the IKKA patch. And then it goes back to being a poke. Now, today, typically, a lot of people might step through with a follow-up palm strike at that stage as well to finish that technique. So if we're doing, of course, if we're doing clipping the storm, when we do clipping the lance in the form, we very definitely have that poke in the eye there instead. So again, technique has wholesale pretty much been lifted and shifted into form 6, but has been edited and moved as clipping the storm in its syllabus. Interesting to just see that again, as I said. If anyone knows why that was the case, why we would have moved to a storm technique down the line and made that the kind of the main technique rather than this new, I don't want to say hidden technique, but essentially it is hidden away from most people until you get to form 6 anyway. I'd be interested in kind of finding that out as well. And then we have the rods. So this is essentially equating to capturing the rod today. Now, there is a little less pistol whipping, to be very clear. We have capturing the rod, which typically has a lift up, a strike in, a strike out at the end. There are, a lot of hitting with the pistols today. Again, just something to be aware of when we're doing this. The technique is what I'm calling out is the principle, as we know, or the idea of it, the initial kind of what it looks like today, or what this kind of reminds me of in today's system. But it's not the exact lift and shift. There is a lot less of, the pistol whipping, as we can see in some of these techniques as well. So again, here, capturing the rod, very definitely in play. We have that initial step in and poke, and then we have that take of the weapon. Here also the call out, as we'll see here. This is a revolver, and we have all heard it now in today's modern slide action pistols, semi-automatic pistols and so on. There are different mechanics at play with the tools that are being used or the weapons that are being used. The gun techniques that we have or the rod techniques that we have are very definitely a product of they were designed for use against a revolver. So as you can see here, revolvers being the thing that were used, different action, different way of behaving to, some of the more modern pistols that we use today as well. Or that are used. We in Ireland don't typically use them unless we're on gun ranges, and that's very limited at this point as well. But again, in this case, we're looking at very much a revolver technique, and just to call that out as well, historically, if you're wondering today and haven't had this information given to you, why we do rod techniques against guns and so on, or what way we're doing it, they were designed against revolvers, not modern pistols, just to be clear. Because, again, 1961, the modern pistol wasn't really, there in the same way. So we have that initial eye poke here. Obviously, that's the object obscurity. Take his mind off it. You have that twist away and keeping the, pistol pointed away. You have that kick. And then the weapon is stripped out and it is a butt strike here. You'll see it, very clearly here. The chamber is, or sorry, not the chamber, the actual butt of the pistol is, used to strike the back of the neck. And again, the barrel is very much pointing away at all points here as well. All right, and here we have our full circle moment in this video as well. So I mentioned earlier on the technique that I called Broken Storm. Again, it was very similar to the initial 2 moves of Broken Rod as it's done today. Now, here I've called this Broken/Twisted Rod, and you will see why in a moment. So, the reason I've called it Broken Rod, as we can see here from the astute among you, Broken Rod is done from the rear in today's system. Again, it is a rear hold-up position. You step around, you clear the arm, you do that break like you saw in Broken Storm, you strike the groin, you step through. I will do a video on this at some point down the line, talking about the whole technique. However, in this case, what we are actually ending up with is Twisted Rod. Twisted Rod being the final rod technique in the syllabus if you take it by the 24 list. Again, you have the grab, you have a check, and you have a force over with that elbow on the wrist to take the person down, take the gun out, or do a kick first, poke in the eye, take the gun out while they're on the ground, as we see here. So again, we have that step through. This hand position is done from the front if we do it as Twisted Rod, as opposed to turning in and doing it from the rear. Broken Rod obviously uses the right hand to clear the weapon and the left hand to do that break, as we discussed earlier on. So here's our grab. Here's that elbow force on the wrist to take that weapon down and take the person down ultimately. And once that happens, then this is the kick through that we would typically do, which takes us across the throat. Now here it's done as a stomp to the arm. And then it's a poke down into the eyes, as we can see. So this is, Twisted Rod per Form 6. We have that lovely moment where we do our crossover, we have our takedown, we have our rip out, and then we have our poke to the ground, and everybody does a loud ki, and it all sounds awesome. This is what we're doing here, and it's also obviously in the technique syllabus as well. So again, we have that poke in the eye going down. So that is the interesting part of all of that for me, is essentially that we have, very much got the bones of many of our techniques here. Things like checking the storm, things like evading the storm, potentially that chain technique, now that we think back on it and some of the notes I made in my head earlier, that roundhouse kick that we do on that chain technique that we saw earlier on could very much be evading the storm. We have that step off, we have that outward block, we have a grab, and then we have a roundhouse kick. We have that as a follow-up punch, so it's more like attacking mace in today's syllabus. But again, it could very definitely be the progenitor to, evading the storm as time came on. We don't address checking the storm here. Which is obviously a technique that was added in later on, and it was part of that kind of initial package of techniques that were taught as basics for yellow belt down the line. There's a lot of techniques that aren't in there. Brushing the storm was the first one that we have here. You have obstructing the storm, which is like bread and butter. Capturing the storm came later. Capturing the storm was possibly that what if to obstructing the storm. What if the stick continues to move? What if you miss it initially? So you catch it and you spin through and you lock it up and you disarm the stick. You do all that fun stuff. So again, there's a lot of things in there that set up what we do today and set up how we approach our weapons today. But the fun part for me here is, as you can see, with that one that I've called Broken Storm and the one that I've called Broken Rod / Twisted Rod here, the techniques very clearly diverted into other things or split into other things, or divided, there's the word that I was trying to use, divided into other things, and then formed the basis or the techniques that we do today. And I particularly am a fan of that last one, just showing the true evolution of where we've been in Kenpo, or where we've come from in Kenpo, being the fact that we are essentially doing two techniques in one here, or at least doing one technique from the position of another that we now have that didn't exist here in these tapes as well. That to me is the true evolution of what we've done. That is where you can see the madness in the method and the method in the madness of what Parker was doing, or what we can presume Parker was doing, being people looking back at it and never being there. And let's be very clear on that. We should all know our station on that. If we were never there in those days, we can presume there were people, and there are people still alive today, who were there at that time, and it's them that we should look to for that information where possible. But it's also just interesting to come up with our own information, to look at these things and really think about, is that the why this is like this, or what relationships are there? If we start thinking about our system in that way, we get a better understanding of how it was structured. We then get a better understanding of why it was structured in that way. And again, it may not have been the right thing for today's purposes, but certainly at the time, as I've said in many times, it was the right thing at that time. It was the right moment for it to exist in that way. There are people out there now to this day who are changing the gun techniques to match more modern firearm protocols. The way we cover out with the gun, instead of, doing the big flashy chamber thing, there are people who are doing the modern shielding practices with it as well. So again, these are things that are interesting to me to look back at and really see what we've done and where we've come from, but also really see that we're not that far away from it. There are elements of everything from this era in the larger, more complex, more theoretical or academic system that we do today. But at its core, it was all there. There was elements of it still there. There were things that, really do exist to today's day. We just didn't necessarily have the same definition on them. And that's difficult to do when you're doing it on black and white, reel to reel tape at this point. There was no audio, or anything else like that. So again, it's interesting to see. But anyway, that is tape 3, and as you can tell, I genuinely, genuinely love the weapon side of things. So this is a slightly longer video, but it's where my heart lies in a lot of this stuff, and I found this one particularly interesting in terms of the way things have gone in our system and so on. So if you are enjoying this, please like, share the video, make sure people know about it as well. Do subscribe if you haven't already. If you have thoughts on anything I've shared, including what we should call chains in the Kenpo technique naming conventions, please feel free to share that as well, or just drop more comments below. And again, just to be clear, not 1959, 1961. See you in the next one.